Good afternoon once again. My name is Franциcka Екcler, and on behalf of the Center for Urban History, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Franциcka Екcler. I'm going to be speaking Ukrainian, and I'll be speaking very slowly. And Franциcka understands Ukrainian, and she understands Russian very well, and she speaks Russian very well. So if you have any questions after the seminar, you can stay here and you can talk to Franциcka in different languages. Franциcka Екcler is here for the second time, so it's her second time in Lviv and at the Center for Urban History. She came here for the first time in 2008, and it was her trip before the dissertation. It's a trip that you can make before you start working on your dissertation. At that time, she was a student at Princeton University, but before that, she had graduated from a master's program at the history faculty in Berlin. She defended her thesis on the topic of the role of women in the Red Army under the supervision of Professor Babarovsky. He's a prominent expert in the Soviet times and the beginnings of the Soviet project in Caucasus. Later, she started doing her postgraduate studies at Princeton University. She had a lot of different research interests, and her topic was quite broad. People, the state, institutions of the post-war period. So how people, institutions, and the state understand the word reckoning, dealing. So how they reckon with what everyone did during the war and how to live with the consequences of the Nazi occupation. Her interest was in World War II and in the Nazi occupation. And she, in particular, studied Soviet Belarusia in the post-war period. As a result of this research, she defended her thesis successfully. That happened last year, if I'm not mistaken. So that happened last year at Princeton University, and that project was implemented in cooperation with Professor Stephen Hodkin. And right now she's trying to transform her thesis into a book. And she spent last year in Florence at one of the universities there. And this year she is working at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And from Moscow via Kyiv, she came to Lviv. And she has come here to tell us more about the recent findings of her research. In particular, she's going to talk about the post-war concept of justice, international law, and we're going to discuss all these issues during the next hour. So I want to welcome Franциcka here at the Center for Urban History and in Lviv.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you very much, of course, for coming this afternoon. I'll, just to double check, is this close enough to the microphone? Closer? Okay. Okay, so I feel like speaking in a microphone is always a little bit strange, so I hope that, now it looks like I'm going to eat the microphone. Okay, so I hope that I won't move too far away from it, otherwise we will get problems with the translation. So again, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. As said, today I am going to talk about Soviet justice, international law, and treason trials, and the connection between those. My talk is roundabout going to take about 40-45 minutes, and in which I'm sort of going to take you through a project which I'm just have been sort of developing this year, particularly working on connecting it to my dissertation project. So let me start with a date. The date, February 18th, 1946. So February 18th, 1946 was the 61st day that prominent Nazi leaders stood on trial in Nuremberg at the International Military Tribunal. They were charged with the following crimes: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Now, February 18th, 1946 was also the day on which another military tribunal began its work. So this trial took place about 1,000 miles east of Nuremberg, in the small town of Marina Gorka, about 40 miles south of Minsk in Soviet Belarus. On this trial, there were 18 men. All of them were Soviet citizens. During the Nazi occupation, they had worked in the German organized police forces, and as such were said to have committed murder and other crimes in the name of German power. So this included the murder and mistreatment of Red Army soldiers, Soviet civilians, and particularly Jews, the theft of state and personal property, and the recruitment of forced laborers. Now, obviously, the legal reckoning, or let's say the legal dealing with Nazi crimes that took place at Nuremberg from 1945 to 1946 is well known, as is perhaps to a lesser extent the legal dealing with the war and the legal dealing with sort of Japanese crimes at Tokyo from 1946 to 1948. In contrast, hardly anyone will ever have heard of the trial in Marina Gorka that sat outside of that town. Nuremberg, despite its many shortcomings and despite sort of the many criticism that has been voiced, continues to be regarded as sort of a landmark moment in the history of the development of international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and human rights. The trial at Marina Gorka, on the other hand, was a seemingly domestic affair only. So you had Soviet citizens on trial, were tried by a Soviet court, and domestic law was applied. And they were also charged with treason, измена Родины. So the ruling did not make any reference to the three legal categories, so crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity that were applied at Nuremberg. Still, there was a connection between the trial at Nuremberg and the trial at Marina Gorka, and it's this connection that I want to explore in my talk today. Both of them form part of what we can call a larger, indeed global moment of punishment, retribution, and justice-seeking in the aftermath of the Second World War. So ultimately what I seek to understand is how the Soviet Union fit into this global moment. So in particular, I'm interested in the connection between the Soviet Union's significant contribution to the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in 1945-1946 on the one hand, and then a series of domestic military trials that took place in the Soviet Union on the other hand. So these domestic military trials essentially fell into two categories. So your trials of Axis power soldiers, mostly German, but also some Hungarians, Austrian nationals, some Japanese nationals, and others, accused of what we nowadays would call war crimes. So this was sort of the first category. And then the second category of trials that were taking place in the aftermath of the Second World War were trials of Soviet citizens accused of treason. And it is that connection between sort of the international level and then these sort of more domestic Soviet Union or national levels, if you will, that I'm trying to explore, that I'm trying to understand. How did this fit together? Was there interaction, overlap, influencing? And then how does this fit into the larger global moment? How did the Soviet case compare to sort of what was happening in East Asia, for instance, after the war? How did it compare to what was happening in non-Soviet Europe at that time? Now I should say that this is work in progress, so I'm particularly happy that I can sort of present this work because I look forward to your questions and comments and thoughts on this because they will help me to reframe or frame the project. And it is mostly based on archive work that I've done so far in Minsk and in Moscow, but I've also just started working in the SBU archive in Kiev. So I just came back from a research trip. Some of that material has made it into this talk, but I still have to go systematically through most of the material that I was able to see in this really excellent archive. So I hope that maybe some of the questions that you can have I can answer in discussion, but haven't made it yet into this talk. So as said, I look forward to your questions, and let's start with sort of the more content-wise stuff. So I said that the trials at Nuremberg and at Marina Gorka form part of a larger, indeed global moment of punishment, retribution, and justice-seeking in the aftermath of the Second World War. But what exactly was that moment? Like, what was global about it? So this is what I'm going to do in the first part of the talk, where I will describe what made this moment global, I'm going to discuss some of the main legal issues and problems, and then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to shift to discussion of the question of how the Soviet Union fit into this. During the Second World War, a large part of Europe, including the western regions of the Soviet Union, were under German Axis power rule, where large parts of East and Southeast Asia were under Japanese occupation. So as the tide of the war turned, the question of retribution, meaning sort of punishment that you believe to be morally right, was increasingly gaining in importance among discussions among the Allies, by which I primarily mean sort of the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. So there was widespread agreement that the Axis powers had violated the laws and customs of war, as they were laid out in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. Yet how to legally deal with the atrocities that the Axis powers, so above all Germany, also the Japanese and others had committed against prisoners of war and civilians, was unclear. Sorry, the technology part of it. Because the problem essentially that the Allies faced is that, while again said there was widespread agreement that they had violated the laws and customs of war, existing international law did not provide answers to two crucial questions. The first question was what actually was a war crime? So what acts actually constituted a war crime? And then the second question that the Allies faced was, even if we define what a war crime is, what institution would actually have the legal authority to prosecute these? I'd say the heart of the issue lay the fact that existing international law only regulated conduct between states. That is to say, it was only concerned with the law between sovereign entities. So if you put it differently, that means that an individual had rights and responsibilities only under domestic law, but not under international law. Which also means that individual criminal responsibility existed only under domestic law. So it was only under domestic law that an individual could be held responsible criminally for a crime. In consequence, sort of for the post-war legal reckoning with the war, that meant, for instance, if State A had occupied State B, and a soldier of a national of State A had mistreated a national of State B during that time, then a State B could, after the war, decide to prosecute that soldier, provided he was sort of in their captivity. However, State B could only do so under its own domestic law. If you wanted to try an individual on an international level, as the Allies intended, then the existing system of international law had to be fundamentally changed. Precisely because you needed to establish that an individual was criminally responsible not just under domestic, but under international law. So this was going to be a big change in the actual legal framework and the actual law that existed. To make like a very long and complicated story short, there are many discussions and negotiations. There is disagreement between those in favor of summary executions, those who were against it. There is lots of political strategizing. There are compromises, various proposals and declarations of intent, but ultimately the Allies found common ground. And on August 8th, 1945, the United States, the United Kingdom, France and the Soviet Union signed the London Agreement, in which the London Agreement again contained the so-called Nuremberg or London Charter, which then laid the legal basis for the prosecution at Nuremberg. So what was particularly revolutionary about the London or the Nuremberg Charter is that, for one, it defined three categories or three acts or defined certain actions as war crimes, and these fell into three categories: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Now, the crucial difference between war crimes and crimes against humanity is that war crimes sort of concerns only the civilian population of prisoners of war in occupied territory, whereas crimes against humanity are essentially murder and ill treatment of any civilian population before or during war. So by that you kind of broaden the scope. It also meant that if you only apply the category of war crimes, sort of the German murder of its own Jewish citizens wouldn't have been covered by that. So you had to sort of, you needed a third category that would also expand to that, so, which is why the notion of crimes against humanity came in. So this was really revolutionary. It was like a revolutionary moment in the development of international law. And the Charter then also determined that these crimes could from now on be tried on an international level, and it announced that an international military tribunal should be created to try Nazi leaders. And I'm sure everybody is sort of familiar with this picture, which shows some of the defendants at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Now, the Allies' concern sort of with the legal dealing of the war was obviously focused on Europe, but they also agreed that Japanese atrocities had to be tried, which is why the International Military Tribunal for the Far East took place at Tokyo from May 1946 to November 1948. It closely followed the Nuremberg model, so you had on trial a series of Japanese political and military leaders, although if you ask a lawyer, this was strictly speaking not an international tribunal, because it was sort of not constituted by several countries, but it was sort of constituted on an order by the American commander at that time in Japan. De facto, though, it was an international military tribunal because of the involvement of many countries at that tribunal. And this is sort of a view of the courtroom in Tokyo of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Now, for a variety of different reasons, Nuremberg actually turned out to be the only international tribunal ever to have taken place until the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in 1993. Most of the trials that took place in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War were what we can call non-international tribunals. And so we can kind of see here the distinction between international and non-international tribunals. They're non-international because they are conducted under either the jurisdiction or the authority of just one state. However, they are also more than just domestic or national trials, because they taken together sort of constituted this global moment of punishment, retribution, and justice seeking, and some of them made reference to each other, so there was an interconnection. Some of them were also legally influenced. The decrees that were issued and that were then applied at these trials were influenced by the London Charter. So there was a sort of, if you will, a content-wise connection. Now, if you sort of divide it into international tribunals and non-international tribunals, then again, the non-international tribunals, sort of just trying to categorize the many, many trials that took place, fell into two categories. And one would be what we can call war crimes trial, and the other were treason trials. Now, war crimes trials were military trials where one state prosecuted the national of a foreign state for having violated the laws and customs of war. These trials were conducted by almost all individual Allied countries throughout Europe and Asia. In most cases, the defendants were German or Japanese military personnel, and they were sort of usually considered minor war criminals. And prior to these trials, each Allied country had issued its own regulations, decrees, and laws that provided the legal foundations for the trial. These were often based on the London Charter, for instance, the British Royal Warrant or the Australian War Crimes Act. Now, I'm sort of going through these legal details a little bit because what I want to do in the second part is to see to what extent the decrees that were developed in the Soviet Union actually were similar to the ones that other states developed, or to what extent they even sort of went ahead of time. Which is why I'm sort of trying to categorize it according to the different sort of legal decrees and the different trials that existed. An example of a war crimes trial, for instance, would be the US Army trials at Dachau from 1945 to 1947, or the 7 Ravensbrück trials that the British military conducted from 1946 to 1948. So apart from these war crimes trials, though, the majority of trials that took place in response to the Second World War were what we can call treason trials, meaning here states in Europe and Asia prosecuted their own nationals for what they had done under foreign occupation. Some of the sort of defendants, or those who were on trial, were accused of having perpetrated acts that would have met the definition of war crimes as put forth in the London Charter. What's interesting, though, is that the charge that they faced was not of having committed war crimes, but of having committed treason. So the law that was applied was domestic law, whether in the form of law that had existed prior to the war, or as part of later regulations, provisions, and decrees, that could also incorporate elements of international law, or a mix of both. To just sort of give a sense of the proportions, in China, for example, about 30,000 individuals were charged with treason in the period 1945 to 1947. So over 30,000 individuals were charged with allegedly having committed treason during the Japanese occupation of China during the war. Approximately 15,000 of them were convicted, for many the sentence with death. If we look at Europe, you can see that sort of the numbers of people who were put on trial by their own governments varied greatly. So few countries actually put as many of their own citizens on trial as Czechoslovakia, where they had probably more than 168,000 people who were tried, and approximately 69,000 of them were convicted. Now, a significant part of these people belonged to the German minority of the country, or they were deemed by the state of belonging to the German minority. Now, this is sort of the rough outline of the global moment of punishment, retribution, justice seeking that took place in the aftermath of the Second World War. So now I'm going to shift to the second part of the talk and would like to discuss how the Soviet Union and its legal dealing with the war fit into this moment. Now, what was the place of the Soviet Union in this? Now, obviously, apart from Nuremberg and apart from Tokyo, also where the Soviet Union was present with a judge and a prosecutor, the Soviets also conducted military trials in their German and Austrian zones of occupation. Indeed, it's interesting they convicted many more German and Austrian nationals than the three Western allies combined. So examples include the Soviet military trial of former Sachsenhausen concentration camp personnel in the fall of 1947 that took place in Berlin, where the Soviet prosecutor invoked the language of Nuremberg by referring sort of to the category of crimes against humanity, but where the actual conviction then occurred under the Soviet Penal Code. In terms of sort of scholarly assessment of these Soviet military trials, we can say obviously that scholars view the Western Allies military trials in a more favorable light overall than Soviet military trials conducted, precisely because Soviet justice as such lacked due process of law. Soviet judiciary considered sort of confessions of guilt, which were usually extracted under torture or often under threat of torture, as sufficient proof of guilt. And so you can see that the Soviet military trials in Germany and Austria did not deviate from the sort of general features of the Soviet legal system. Now, in a similar vein, sort of Soviet involvement in Nuremberg is usually considered a stain on the history of the development of international law, sort of considered as sort of unavoidable, but in a very positive assessment of Nuremberg that has been written is always considered kind of like the negative side aspect that one might not necessarily want to point to too much because dictatorships do not really make for respectable judges. And indeed, it's true that Stalin and sort of the circle of leading Bolsheviks, for them, Nuremberg was both an educative trial and a global stage on which you could sort of showcase the superiority of the Soviet project. There was also, which is interesting, direct personnel continuity between the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg and the lawyers who had been instrumental of the Moscow show trials from 1936 to 1938, which had convicted several leading Bolsheviks on treason. So the same person who had presided over the Moscow show trials, General Prosecutor of the Soviet Union Andrei Vyshinsky, was secretly in charge of the Soviet commission that oversaw and managed Moscow's participation in Nuremberg. While the Soviet Union's chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Roman Rudenko, had presided over a series of show trials in Ukraine between 1936 and 1938. So the personnel that we see, or the delegation that we see at Nuremberg, was actually sort of coming out of the Soviet system, and even more so had sort of played crucial roles in the series of show trials in the 1930s. Now, having said that, we can see that recently sort of there has been, like, I guess we can say, re-evaluation or maybe a reconsideration of the Soviet participation at Nuremberg. Francine Hirsch, who works on the Soviets' involvement at Nuremberg, has highlighted, for instance, that not only the Soviet Union, but really all four allies sort of saw the International Military Tribunal as a means to advance their own state interests and foreign policies. And all of them, to varying degrees, were concerned that the trial might reveal sensitive information about their own wartime conduct. And also, plus on top of that, all of them shared sort of in more or less implicit, but sometimes explicit agreement that you wouldn't talk too much about, or you wouldn't talk about your own crimes. So this is part of sort of the criticism, obviously, of Nuremberg, that, you know, the crimes that the Allies committed weren't on trial. And again, among all the Allies, there was a sort of an understanding that let's not go there, you know, let's not mention each other's crimes. Sort of. Although it's also interesting is that Moscow became increasingly frustrated during the conduct of the trial because they felt that the Western Allies weren't sticking to that, and they weren't sort of keeping their original kind of promises. Now, in a sense, you can say, international law obviously was an instrument to a certain extent for all of them. What is particularly interesting is, though, that Moscow did not only use international law as saw or understood international law as a tool, it also shaped it significantly in that very same process. So beyond the taking part in preparing and organizing the trial, the Soviet side, for instance, makes significant contributions to the legal framework of the International Military Tribunal. In particular, one Soviet lawyer, Adam Trainin, can be credited with formulating the principle of the criminality of aggressive war, which then found its application at Nuremberg at crimes against peace, and also with elaborating the concept of complicity. So complicity being sort of the act of helping or encouraging others to commit a crime, which then likewise found its application at Nuremberg. The Soviet contribution to the development of international law, actually, and if you will, more broadly speaking, to the legal reckoning with the Second World War, was not limited to Nuremberg. And so at the heart of the issue here are the trials of captured Axis soldiers, which mostly meant German in this case, that Moscow conducted as early as late 1943 and continued until 1955. So overall, Soviet military courts convicted about 34,000 German prisoners of war, more than half of them in 1949. So what I'm just sort of because we're halfway, I think, through the talk, what I wanted to do now in the next, in the second part of the talk is sort of see how these trials of Axis soldiers and then the trials of Soviet citizens were connected to the development of international law, how we can trace that, if it's possible to trace that through the decrees in parts, but also through the practice. And then I'm going to move on to sort of looking at information politics and the different levels on which these trials were reported to understand how, again, the Soviet Union not only understood international law, but also how it experimented with this overlap between international and domestic law. Now, the trials of Axis soldiers, and again, mostly German, and if I'm going to talk about the trials of German soldiers in sort of, by that I mean mostly German soldiers, but there are also other Axis personnel such as Austrians, Hungarians, or Japanese. These trials were usually conducted in secret, and if they were conducted in secret, they were often mass trials, meaning that a trial lasted about 15 minutes. Defense counsel and witnesses were not present. Verdicts had been prepared in advance, and torture had often been applied during preceding the interrogation. The law that was applied was different. So of the convicted German soldiers, you have about 20,000 were tried under a special April 1943 decree, or ukaz, while the remaining prisoners were tried under the Soviet Russian Penal Code. This April 1943 decree is, I think, very interesting, because in combination with sort of certain developments preceding it and then following it, it can provide sort of significant clues about the connection that Moscow saw between the punishment of German and Axis soldiers on the one hand, and then the larger international effort at sort of dealing with Nazi crimes. What's important to know in all of this is that from early on into the war, Moscow had declared its intention to hold the Germans accountable for the various atrocities that they had committed against prisoners of war and civilians in occupied Soviet regions. So particularly noteworthy here is a note from 14th October 1943 in which Molotov, the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, went a major step beyond all previous proposals and suggestions, Soviet and Western alike, and declared that Moscow considered it absolutely necessary to conduct, I quote, a special international tribunal that would try the leaders of Nazi Germany. So in other words, we can actually see that among the major allies, the Soviet Union took the lead, sort of pushing for the establishment of an international tribunal. Then half a year later, Moscow also took the lead in formulating a decree that was applied by domestic military courts, and which would provide the foundation for the Soviet prosecutions of Germans below sort of the top leadership level, as well as the prosecutions of other Axis countries, or soldiers of other Axis countries. Now, this April 1943 decree did not establish a legal definition of war crimes, so it did not use the word военное преступление, for instance. A status book of atrocities, zverstva, violence, насилие, reprisals, rasparabia, of having tortured, strung up, shot or burnt alive, captured Red Army soldiers and civilians in occupied territory. However, I think the decree, we can see in practice, fulfilled similar legal functions, as sort of later Western decrees did, such as the British Royal Warrant or the Australian War Crimes Act. So in a way you can say that the idea behind this decree, in other words, that certain acts by individual Axis power soldiers, as described in the decree, constituted crimes that demanded punishment, that this idea, as sort of put in this ukaz, foreshadowed the definition of war crimes as laid out later than in the London Charter. So the Soviet Union was not only the first to issue this decree, they were also then the first to take actual steps towards the prosecution of German soldiers. In late November 1943, Stalin ordered that an open military trial should be conducted in Kharkiv. And it was there in Kharkiv that from December 15th to December 18th, 1943, 3 German soldiers were selected to sort of present an assortment of military ranks and branches of the German armed forces and stood on trial, who were then charged under the April 1943 decree and sentenced to death and eventually hanged in public. Now what is noteworthy about this trial is that I think are 3 things. For one, you had a staging that was sort of very similar to pre-war domestic practices. Internal secret police documents, which are notoriously difficult to obtain about these trials, but which Nikita Petrov of the Memorial Society was able to analyze, have showed that while Moscow was really careful to present an image of legality at these trials, including sort of presentation of witnesses and defense counsel, the Soviet prosecution actually knew that there are some discrepancies between indictment, conviction, and evidence, which eventually didn't really matter that much because the defendants had confessed to the guilt anyhow, which then was sort of under Soviet law enough for the prosecution. So the staging of the trial was interesting and showed continuities to the pre-war. What is also interesting is that the trial was widely publicized, so it was not only in both in sort of the Republican press and the Central press and also the local press, but it was also publicized in English and clearly geared at sort of an international Western audience. So you had books that emerged right away. And there was an allusion made to international law in sort of the form of the complicity charge. What I think all of this suggests is that Moscow essentially thought of this December 1943 Kharkiv trial as a testing ground for an international trial of Nazi leaders. So in other words, this trial was, I think, an experiment to see how the Western Allies would respond to the Soviet version of war crime trials, and at the same time you could send a strong signal to Nazi Germany, announcing that their trials, the crimes wouldn't remain unprosecuted. So this is sort of, I think, the international connection that we can see in the Kharkiv trial. There was also, however, a domestic connection on a different level. And that domestic connection possibly even ran deeper. So with this trial, Moscow not only demonstrated that Germans would not go unpunished, it also demonstrated that Soviet citizens would not go unpunished. So apart from the 3 Germans who were on trial, there was also a Soviet citizen who had worked as a driver for the Kharkiv SS and who was like the 3 German soldiers sentenced to death. What is more, the Kharkiv trial was actually the second public military trial of individuals who were accused of wartime wrongdoings in the name of German power. The first one had taken place in July 1943 in Krasnodar. And in this case, the defendants were all Soviet citizens, 11 Soviet citizens. All of one had worked for an SS unit. So if we compare the July 1943 Krasnodar trial of Soviet citizens and the Kharkiv, December 1943 Kharkiv trial of 3 Germans and 1 Soviet citizens, we can see that even though the Soviet citizens at the Krasnodar trial were charged for treason, otherwise the Kharkiv trial closely followed the Krasnodar model. There was the complicity charge invoked, for instance. The trial was also staged, meaning it was very much the witnesses, for instance, were not required to testify that they had direct knowledge or any relationship to the defendants. And again, the trial was not only attended by a large audience, but it was also covered widely in various media outlets, including print, radio, and film, as well as Soviet government-sponsored English language books. Now, I'm not sort of suggesting that we can draw a clear line between Krasnodar, Kharkiv, and Nuremberg. For that, there are too many contingencies and too many developments that would have been unforeseeable at that time period, and too many factors, obviously, that played a role. But I think what this shows is that the Soviet regime was clearly experimenting with ways of bringing domestic and international prosecution together, which is also something I think that we can see in later trials. Oh, sorry, forget the slide. So, oh no, I actually did not forget it. So, which is also something we can see in later trials. So these are just examples of some of the public military trials of Axis soldiers that took place, the ones that were were public in the sense that they're open to a local audience, but also public in the sense that they were being publicized, that they were reported on in the press. So as you can see, we have the July 1943 trial, December 1943, and then in December 1945 and January 1946, while Nuremberg was still going on, there are trials in 8 Soviet Western cities taking place, and German soldiers were mostly on trial. In October to December 1947, there's another series of trials taking place in 9 Soviet Western cities, which I think is connected to, there's the early sort of emerging Cold War. There's also the Sachsenhausen trial in Berlin that's taking place in October 1947. So there's sort of a, something that, as I want to explore further, is this precisely this connection about when is a trial organized in the Soviet Union, what is sort of the international context of it. So the trials from October to December 1947 are clearly following Sachsenhausen. If you can see sort of the correspondence from the order coming from Molotov about the organization of the trials, and so this is seen as part of one universe belonging together. And then December 1949, sort of in mini Tokyo, at Khabarovsk, we have Japanese soldiers on trial. Now, as said, it's very difficult to find sources on these trials because this is NKVD and MVD material, so it's secret police material, which obviously in Russia and in Belarus is not systematically or at all available to researchers. But I managed to find pictures of a trial of Hungarian generals, officers and soldiers, which was one of these trials that took place in the fall of 1947, and it took place in Chernigov. And you can see, hopefully, sort of this is a view of the courtroom. The members of the military tribunal are on stage, and then the audience was opened up to locals who could attend. There was also a large sort of agentura present, so the secret police was very much concerned about what people were saying about the trials, and so they had placed sort of agentura, they had placed officers in the courtroom who would then later report on what locals had supposedly said. Or they were asking their informers about what locals had supposedly said about the trial. This is a close-up of the members of the military tribunal. And here you can see the defense attorneys, so the advocati, and then behind them the defendants, some of the Hungarian general soldiers and generals, officers and soldiers, which was deliberately chosen. So the order came from Moscow. The pattern was always the same. And this was very much orchestrated from Moscow, the number of generals who should be on trial, the numbers of officers, the numbers of soldiers. And the pattern then extended to all the other Soviet cities. Okay, let's see how we're doing time lapse. Now, I think this was... okay. So, I think here again in these trials that are taking place then in the later post-war years, there is this connection between the international and the sort of more domestic. At the same time, we can also see, I think, this connection if we go down to the very local level. So if we go down to local military trials of Soviet citizens that took place in various localities, also in the immediate post-war years. Now, as the Soviet Union was sort of, or as the Red Army was reconquering more and more territory, the secret police quickly set out to investigate locals' wartime history. And there was a series of trials, I think very much improvised, for example, like this one, that was taking place right after sort of the Red Army had reconquered territory. So this is from Smolensk region in September 1943, just after the Red Army had reconquered that territory. And this kind of suggests how improvised these early trials were. On trial was the village head, where you can see where the arrow points to, and what looks like sort of mostly women, probably inhabitants of the village, as well as sort of soldiers who were witnessing that trial. So my sense is that this was very quick justice, if you want, so that these things took place within hours, and then the army unit moved on. Now, as sort of the Red Army reconquered more and more territory, and especially after the end of the war, these trials became much more professional, elaborate, if you will. So they're more organized, and they took place then similar to the pictures that you saw of Chernigov. These local trials were then also conducted in, for instance, a local a club. And one of these trials was the trial that I mentioned at the very beginning, the trial at Marina Gorka on 18 February 1946, where 18 men stood on trial. Let me see, just to give you a sense of the location of Marina Gorka. So all of the defendants, as said, were Soviet citizens. All of them had worked in the German organized police forces during the Nazi occupation of the district, and as such they were said to have committed crimes in the name of German power. The trial took 6 days. It concluded on 24th February 1946, and sentencing 5 of the men to death, and the rest were forced labor camp sentences. But it's interesting that we can also see that over the course of the 6 days, more than 10,000 local residents, people from the district, Puchovice district and neighboring districts attended the trial. And it probably took place in the local club, which was built on the sort of the site where a church had once stood, which was then town during the late 1930s. I couldn't quite locate it. I actually went to the town and tried to find out. It was possibly this building, the city center, which might have been pre-war origin, but I'm not entirely sure. But it was the only sort of significantly big building that I could find left over. In any sense, this is a small town. I mean, this is really much more, it feels more like a village. And so the fact that 10,000 people came meant that this was really sort of an event that was happening in the district, that people talked about, and that was known in that district. It was a large event. You had 140 witnesses that testified in court, and according at least to the secret police report, 52 more people asked to be heard. Locals attended the trial, and locals were also on trial. Of the 18 accused men, 14 were born in Puchovice district. So meaning this was a trial that was deliberately chosen, sort of and geared at a local audience. What is interesting about this trial are the information politics surrounding it. So although it was open for the public to attend, it doesn't mean that it was a much publicized affair beyond the locality in which it took place. Now if you, I hope this is sort of visible. So you can see the outlines of Puchovice district, and sort of the red lines mark today's borders, which were probably sort of corresponding to the ones back then. But in any sense, this is sort of a smaller district south of Minsk. We look at the newspaper coverage, that we can see that the 1946 Marina Gorka trial was reported neither in the Republic-wide press, so Sovietskaya Belarusia, nor in the regional press, so not in the Oblast newspaper, or in any of the newspapers of the neighboring districts. So it was only the local newspapers of Puchovice district that published 2 articles on that trial, which included the names of the men, the verdict. So after the widely publicized July 1943 Krasnodar trial of Soviet citizens, neither the all-union press like Pravda or Izvestia, nor sort of Republican versions like Sovietskaya Belarusia, Sovietskaya Ukraina, mentioned a single trial of Soviet citizens who were accused of being traitors and German accomplices. It was only until about February 1960, so shortly before the Eichmann trial in Israel, that articles about Soviet citizens who stood on trial sort of appeared in the Republican and sort of the Central press, in the main Soviet newspapers. So in other words, we can see that in the first 15 years after the war, the authorities sort of were conducting trials which were open to locals, but they're at the same time, when it came to newspaper coverage, sort of determined to keep public references to the involvement of Soviet citizens in the German occupation regime to a minimum. What then sort of was the rationale sort of behind this mix of public yet hardly publicized military trials? So in other words, what was sort of could have been the rationale between sort of the careful balancing between local visibility and otherwise the silences? I think if you sort of analyze this information regime and what information was made available on what levels, can kind of provide important clues into how Moscow both understood and again experimented with international and domestic justice. So I think they fulfilled several purposes. For one, obviously it's the proof that Soviet power has returned when you conduct a trial in a local setting. You also, however, open up the trial to the public and thus potentially provide local victims with the space to voice demands for punishment. So this is obviously a tricky question. It's a question of the sources. How do we evaluate local responses to the trial? The NKVD reports or the secret police reports are obviously very notoriously difficult. Do we think that when an informer reports on a person having said something about a trial, has that person actually said that? Has the informer made it up? Is the informer maybe sort of catering to what they think the secret police wants to hear about the trials? So secret police information is very difficult, and I'm not saying that we can easily read it as sort of a one-on-one response of, oh, look, we have the informers telling the secret police what locals said about trials, so obviously this is a local response to that. So it's a difficult question. Also, the witnesses who testified on trial were carefully chosen, and they're obviously prepared. So that doesn't mean that what they said was scripted. There was obviously some sort of kind of freedom, but it's said in the internal secret police reports, you know, there's orders are being given to look for suitable witness, and it's being said thoroughly check these people. You know, make sure that there won't be any surprises, essentially. Still, I think, and I'm this is a suggestion and venturing out there, but I do think that there's a difference between the pre-war trials and the post-war trials. In the sense, there's a difference between the trials 1937, 1938, which were held, where people were then charged with being members of counter-revolutionary Trotskyist or other national sort of organizations, and these trials, because in these cases, especially if we have local trials, locals knew much more what other locals had done, and sort of the things that they had done were much more visible than they were before the war. So, for instance, in the case of Marina Gorka, a woman testified on trial whose daughter was murdered by one of the policemen. And when she asked sort of the military tribunal to hang the man and to sort of administer the death sentence, and the audience applauded, I think we can read this as a sign of that there was sort of at least some acknowledgement or some sort of some, if you will, consentment or some even approval of sort of certain forms of sort of justice in that particular moment, in that particular trial that is happening. Okay, so beyond sort of what kind of functions these trials might have potentially fulfilled for locals, and to what extent people could maybe find overlap between their own understandings of justice in this particular moment and sort of Soviet understanding or the authorities' understanding of justice, I think a third point is, or a third function that these trials, and again the newspaper coverage of these trials fulfilled, is that we can see how Moscow can portray itself as sort of the guarantor of justice on several levels. So for an avid newspaper reader in Marina Gorka, for instance, who read the local newspaper and who also read the Republican newspaper, so that person, he or she would have known that Germans were on trial in Nuremberg because the local newspaper reported about Nuremberg, or Nazi leaders were on trial in Nuremberg. He or she would also know that German soldiers were at the very same time, or had at that time, just a month early in January 1946, been on trial in Minsk. So there would have been an understanding of that German soldiers were held responsible for what they had done in Soviet Belarus during the war. And they could then link it to the local prosecution of Soviet citizens, what was happening in their trial. So in a way, then, the Soviet state could portray itself sort of as the guarantor of justice on the local, on the national, and on the international level. And if you wanted, you could make that connection through the newspaper coverage. Okay, so this is essentially, sort of to sum up what I think the connection between the international and the domestic trials were, the international and the domestic legal reckoning with the trials were. Again, I think that we can clearly see how there is an experimenting, there's a trying to figure out how you can shape justice and how you can use trials from the side of Moscow. There are some pre-war continuities, clearly, not just in the terms of personnel, but also in the way that the trials were organized. It is interesting, for instance, I briefly mentioned before, but there was also, during the Great Terror in 1937, 1938, you likewise had local trials taking place, sort of people in localities, which also were only publicized in the localities. So while the Moscow show trials were published in the Center press, the local trials, for instance, that were taking place in eastern Ukraine, I've seen a couple now in the SBU archives, were only then mentioned in the local press, and you can also find that in Russia and other republics. So in a way you can see the pre-war continuities in the newspaper coverage and the information politics shining through in a different context now after the war. Now, I think there's an experimenting happening with international domestic law and the overlap, but I think that doesn't mean that Moscow is sort of unambiguous about the ways in which it chose to deal with the aftermath of Nazi occupation. Meaning, I think we can nevertheless see a certain ambivalence shining through in this particular approach. So we can see this ambivalence in the carefully calibrated ways in which news or information is being reported. Because on the one hand you can say it's a very smart strategy to portray yourself differently on different levels. On the other hand you can also say that it speaks to a certain kind of anxiety. You know, you don't want to make too public the extent of the amount of trials that you're actually conducting of Soviet citizens. You don't want to make that too visible. One of the reasons why you didn't want to make that probably too visible is because at the same time there was a clear narrative of the war in case in the obviously the All-People's War, which in the case of Belarus, for instance, was the All-People's Partisan War, which sort of held that apart from a few Soviet citizens, everybody had stood united behind the regime. So that could have created a tension if you make sort of the public military trials too public, or too publicized. At the same time, there is also, I think, an ambivalence or a tension between sort of the everyday narrative and then the everyday suspicion towards people who lived in occupied territory, which sort of was reflected then in the denial of educational opportunities or jobs, entrance to universities. And so this discrepancy is also something where we see the ambivalence, which I think is ultimately never resolved until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Дуже дякую, Franziska. So thank you very much. Maybe I will. I think that there are many questions, and I will just ask a rather tiny one, following your scope, geographical scope, from globe down to the level. One can even say that not only history takes place, but justice takes place, and it takes place in this very particular premises and buildings, as you mentioned. And while there are plenty of ways to look from these courtrooms, I actually would like maybe you to, at this point, well, we still have images in your slide. How was the design there, of actually, because you mentioned that this was staged, and we have this design of places and choice of location and setting up the places where who has to sit, and whether to looking from this, on one hand, composition and definitely visual representation, because it's still it's a filter, whether one can also find this tangibility of content, like the settings where concepts are living, and in this way from different localities and take it back to the global scope. Because information about courts was published in different newspapers and was sometimes accompanied with visual, with images of places. Nuremberg, setting up there, Tokyo settings, Minsk and these places. So just giving it materiality and for the concepts and practices. So if you could maybe a little bit comment here, and then I will open the floor to many more questions, which I hope are coming up.
Yeah. So the photos that I showed, maybe you can go back to the pictures. So it seems to me that, to my knowledge, these pictures were not published. If anybody in the audience knows sort of differently, but I haven't seen them in the newspaper. So when the newspapers report on the trials, it is usually without a picture. I'm not sure if that has something to do with the possibilities at that point. There are very rarely any pictures published in newspapers, and then right after the war, I don't know if that was sort of technical reasons, sort of thing, or so these pictures I found in the files that are in the SPU archive, and they might have been the files that you can see sort of on the table there, essentially. I should also say that I haven't seen any pictures of Nuremberg in the Soviet newspapers as well, so it was very much textual, if you will. You know, it was all about text. So if we talk about, for instance, the coverage also of the local trials in Marina Gorka, these are small, short articles, but these are also newspapers that are only 2 pages, 4 pages at best. So it is all very much depending on, it's text only. What is interesting though is that you can tell that these trials were also talked about in factories and or in workplaces. So while they were taking place, for instance, while the trials of German soldiers in 1945, 1946, a series of trials was taking place in the Soviet Union, these things were discussed in workplaces, and so then by that, even if you didn't read the newspapers, you would still get the information about these trials, obviously. In case you would probably be more likely to get them through your workplace and through the meetings there than you were to get them probably through the newspapers. So in that sense, you can say it was very much an oral sort of culture of talking about these trials and less the visibility. Although, when it came to the actually executing in this case mostly the death sentences, then this was done on the local. For instance, in Nikolaev, it was done on the local square, and then people attended these, just like in Kiev or in Minsk, sort of local attended these, the hanging essentially. And people were sort of, the men who were hanged were left there, I think in the case of Nikolaev, if I'm not mistaken, 1 or 2 days essentially. So there's a staging of the perpetrators, so people can go and then watch, even if you didn't make it to the actual execution, which, at least according to secret police reports, was very much a crowded event and many people wanted to go and actually see that. Then you could still have what time happened after, a day after, and go there. So that can be interpreted in certain ways also. So again, speaking about the secret police reports, what they report on is that they say that there's widespread sort of feeling of, or wanting of retribution. And so then informers quote other, like, Soviet citizens having said that I want to see these people torn into pieces, you know, I wouldn't even put them on trial. So these reports stress that there is lots of sort of visceral sort of need for retribution. Now, whether this is what people said or not, what is interesting is the way that the secret police then categorized these responses. So these responses were not categorized as inhuman or maybe too much, but these were sort of the proper responses, the ones that you know, you were expecting or you were at least not unhappy with. Then once or twice people are responded, sort of quoted as saying, one woman is sort of quoted as saying, well, but the Germans are only humans too. And then that is, in the secret police report, categorized as an anti-Soviet remark. So it's sort of interesting. I think we can read these informal reports, if not as reflections of, you know, what people actually said, but then we can read them as reflections of what the secret police thought about and how they categorized responses and what their understanding of these trials was, and what the right kind of responses were, and the responses that were undesirable and supposedly anti-Soviet.
Thank you. So, please, if we have questions, there are questions and comments, just raise your hand and say there are 2 microphones here, and just say who you are, even if you know who you are.
Good afternoon. Thank you for such a great presentation. I have found out a lot of new things. My name is Oksana Kis. I have the following question. I deal with female stories. So my question is related to the gender dimension of this research. It's obvious that when we're talking about military tribunals, when servicemen, soldiers, and generals were put on trial, there were very few females on trial. But at local courts, when we're talking about collaboration crimes and treason trials, there were some female defendants, I think. So my question is as follows. Those women that were indicted on treasons, whether the proceedings were the same for men and women, and whether the verdicts were the same for males and females, or you can see some gender differences in terms how men and women were tried. And the second question is, in what other roles were women present at these courts? Did they play the roles of defendants, witnesses, or maybe also prosecutors or defense counsels? So how were women represented at all these courts? I'm asking mostly about these local trials, because as far as I understand, if we're talking about international trials, women were not really present because most of them were men soldiers.
Mm-hmm. I was told I should turn this off and then turn this back on. Well, thank you very much for the question. As for the first question, the differences in the judgments, that's a really good question. It's also a difficult question because of, again, of the problem that the material is not systematically available. I don't know if you've sort of been researching this and would know more about it than I do. The judgment or the trials that I have seen, both the secret trials and the material on the public trials, is that it was overwhelmingly men. Obviously also because of the categories, the kinds of jobs that people had, or the positions in which they had worked under the Germans for which they were then accused. But as far as I can judge, I didn't see differences, but then again, like the number of women that I've seen on trial might also not be representative. In order to be able to sort of make that statement. I do sometimes wonder whether, for instance, when it came to this is a different field, but when it came to the suspicion that the Soviet authorities held towards people who lived in occupied territory, then there was clearly a gender dimension, in the sense that women were sort of more likely to be accused of sort of having lived with German soldiers or officers, or having prostituted themselves, or there were sort of various kinds of derogatory names that these women were called. At the same time, when it comes to sort of the question of were you expected to fight, were you expected to go to the forest and join a partisan unit, if a partisan unit was there, then my understanding is that there was a different kind of, or the Soviet authorities took a different kind of position, and in the sense that women were less expected to go to the forest and sort of fight, whereas the men, if you were an able-bodied man and you stayed in occupied territory, for the sort of the returning Soviet authorities, there was no reason why you couldn't have gone to the forest, essentially. Whereas women, I think there was more of a leniency, because of sort of traditional understandings of female and male roles, and that women were supposed to sort of care for elderly and the children, and fighting sort of traditionally seen as sort of the job of men. As for sort of female participation at these trials, so women were also serving as witnesses on these trials, and whether in equal parts, probably, again, like statistically would be hard to sort of pin down, but my sense is sort of both women and men were represented equally. In terms of the responses to the trials, and in terms of the audience, also it seems to me women and men were sort of more or less equally presented. When it came to the prosecution and the members, the judges and the attorneys, this was usually male. Obviously, I mean, sort of, as you can sort of clearly see as evidenced on this picture. But hold on, there was one thing I wanted to say. But what we can see, for instance, on this very improvised trial. This is, I mean, that's a different situation because it seems to be a military unit, a Red Army unit, and it might have been sort of a secret police unit within the Red Army that was carrying out this trial. Here, clearly, there's the sort of the typical wartime, post-war gender imbalance that the civilians are overwhelmingly women, obviously female, and the soldiers are overwhelmingly men. Although I think standing on the right, you can see a woman right next to the three members of the military tribunal, female soldiers who sort of is part of that. I don't know if she was sort of the traditionally, you know, sort of the typist, or what other function she might have fulfilled there.
Sara i potem Eleonora.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have actually two questions. I'm Sarah Granka, I'm from Germany. I'm a student of Eastern European Studies in Munich and right now here for a couple of weeks in Lviv for an internship. I have a question about regional differences. Can you see any regional differences of the trials in, I don't know, the Baltic states, Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, Western Belarus, Eastern Belarus? And the second one was, what about remembrance of these trials? Did you find anything about that? Maybe some, I don't know, some kind of memorials, some kind of memorial plaques or anything like that? Thank you.
Regional differences. Also a really good and really difficult question. Again, there might be people in the audience who know more about this, about the trials in Ukraine. I've said, like, when it comes to the domestic trials, I've mostly worked on the case of Belarus. And sort of now broadening it to include sort of other Soviet regions. Like, my understanding is obviously that these trials became very much mixed up with the Soviet fight against nationalist formations, or what from Moscow, you know, what they call bandits. So there was obviously sometimes an overlap in terms of the membership, where some people who served in the local German police forces were then later on also parts or members of anti-Soviet partisan formations. Although not necessarily, I mean, these trials are then politicized also and become a part of that. So there's an overlap after the war, so to say. And in regions, my guess is that in regions like West Ukraine and Lithuania, that was very much more the case than in West Belarus, where you did have some let's call them anti-Soviet partisan formations active. So there were especially Ukrainians in Paliesi, in the southern part of Belarus. The Armia Krajova was there until early 1945, and a little bit beyond in western Belarus, so in the former Polish part. Then there are some groups that the sort of in secret police material called Lithuanian and Belarusian nationalist formations. So there's something there, definitely, but there's not quite as much activity as in West Ukraine or in Lithuania. It's more, the situation in western Belarus is more comparable to the situation in Estonia and Latvia. So in that sense, these trials become, especially in the ones that I've seen in Belarus, often are primarily concerned with what people have done during the German occupation. Again, sometimes there's an overlap, but and then there you don't really necessarily see the West-East difference so much. So you don't necessarily see the difference between the old Soviet part and the new Soviet part, between the formerly Polish part so much, precisely because sort of the German occupation regime, whether civilian or military government, was organized the same on the lower levels, because you had police forces everywhere, whether in the parts that were only annexed in 1939 or old Soviet parts. So the question of legal reckoning with that was the same then in older new Soviet parts. So in response to that, to make it short, I would say the regional differences certainly do exist, but when it came to sort of the underlying structure of it, I would surmise that they weren't that present. And in terms of remembrance of the trials, tricky question. So I can only speak mostly for Belarus in that case. I don't think that there is much remembrance of that post-war period, which has to do in like the trials in the sense of they becoming like an alternative site for other alternative discourses, which mostly my sense understanding has to do with the fact that, for one, this period is still very much, or the narrative of that period as written by historians is very much still influenced by sort of what you can maybe call the official narrative, or that, and if historians engage with the aftermath of the war, then it's a lot of it focused on economic reconstruction. Because some of these issues are still to this day a little bit tricky and can easily be politicized, and given sort of the political constellation in Belarus, for some people, it's not something that might, how should I put it? You can write about that and you can research that, but it's just not something where the research interest is. I think the research interest is mostly with the war and not necessarily the immediate post-war period.
So we got Eleonora here, and then Good.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I have a question related to the concept of treason. I would like to hear more from you as from an expert in this field. What is the legal definition of betrayal or treason according to the Soviet law? Was this legal definition monolithic, or maybe there were some degrees of severity, or so? What was sufficient? What was an act that was sufficient to be classified or qualified as a treason? And another question: was treason defined mostly from an impressionistic point of view? So someone recognized someone as a betrayer or traitor, or maybe there existed some clear-cut criteria, or maybe even hierarchy of what qualifies as a treason. So how do you know that something is a treason or someone is a traitor?
And then maybe then we will get 3 questions, and then.
Yeah, hello, my name is Lutz. I'm a writer and an amateur historian. What surprised me during your talk was just the sheer number of trials and the effort that went into these trials. You had lawyers and you had prosecutors and all of that. Why, I wonder, did they go through the motions of pseudo-justice, this kind of pseudo-legalism, when the regular practice only a few years earlier had been to simply pick people up at night and deport them to Siberia and shoot them in the neck? Would have been a lot easier. Why did they suddenly go through these extensive motions of pseudo-justice? I don't quite understand that.
Thank you. And may I just give a small comment too?
Maybe then we have question, answer, and then I will bring in the comment.
Okay, I have 2 questions. So one question is how the topic of destruction of the Jewish population was reflected in all these trials on the local level and in this all-union press. And my another question is about do you plan somehow to trace this topic further? I mean into 1960s, 70s and 80s, because you mentioned Eichmann trial. It influenced the Soviet Union quite strongly, and how do you think the international context was it very relevant and important also for this later period, and especially in relation to this trials of collaborators? It was very interesting and important, theme for this later period of Soviet society. Thanks.
Great. Right, microphone. Great question. So treason. So treason was qualified as a counter-revolutionary crime. So this is sort of in the penal code. It depended on, so in the Russian penal code, sort of the article is 58, but you also, like in other penal codes of the other republics, was a different article. But essentially, these penal codes were, when it came to the part on counter-revolutionary trials, counter-revolutionary crimes, the same. So you could apply the Russian penal code, you could also apply the Republican penal code. It didn't make a big difference. But yeah, as you're sort of, your question points to, that was exactly the problem, that it wasn't quite clear what exactly constituted treason. Like, so the entry in the penal code is very short when it comes to treason. It says it's mena rodine, and then it sort of warrants the death sentence. But that was precisely also a problem during the war. That there wasn't quite a lot of, like, no enough clarity on just what exactly should be treason, and are we going to make a difference between the different kinds of acts that people have committed. So are we going to try somebody who as a local policeman perhaps personally participate in the shooting of Jewish community of Jews, are we going to try them for treason just as somebody who worked as a local village head or somebody who worked as a translator for the Germans? And so that was a big problem. So there are a series of decrees issues, and the 1943 April ukaz actually helped to clarify, and it was, I think, also aimed at clarifying that, because it essentially made a distinction between acts that would warrant the death sentence, which included murder of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, and then acts that would only sort of say receive a lengthy forced labor sentence, which were if you were sort of contributing to or helping somehow in some sort to bring about these acts. But even then, like, you can see in practice that this distinction that was made was still too blurry, and also obviously, like, local military tribunals had a certain kind of leeway in making their decisions. Now, the decisions that they then make go through a review process, and so in the course of that review process, the decision could often still be overturned for technical reasons, or because sort of it was said that an article wasn't applied correctly. But nevertheless, there is a leeway for that, and I think the non-clarity of it is actually what constitutes treason also continues, and not just sort of when we think of policemen, but just in general. I think it speaks to the fact that when you were looking at translators, or when you were looking at people who worked as a cleaning lady, for instance, for the Germans, all of these issues all of a sudden became much more less clear than in the case of policemen. And there's also, if we look at, I think, patterns of punishment, you can see that during the war, punishment overall was more strict than after the war. So in 1943, for instance, when the Red Army is sort of reconquering, in this case, for instance, Smolensk region, the punishment that was meted out there was much, much stricter than the punishment that we can see happening in a year later in large parts of Belarus. So there is the majority of people actually end up receiving, the majority of Soviet citizens actually end up receiving not death sentences, but sort of imprisonment, prison sentences, or forced labor sentences after the war. And so, which I think reflects also changing priorities as sort of, again, as the Red Army was reconquering more and more territory. What is interesting about this language of treason is obviously that it's also already used before the war. I mean, that's sort of, it's there in the 1920s, it's there in the 1930s, so you can easily use it and politicize it. So at the Moscow show trials, the men Molchiks on trial were also accused of treason, but then what is, and I think what also makes obvious this question about the continuity and change, or, you know, to what extent is this pre-war justice, to what extent is post-war justice difference so tricky, is precisely that while you had sort of this justice system in place, and there are many, you know, structural continuities, at the same time you had a very different context, and you had like massive sort of millions of crimes that had actually been committed, which maybe leads over to your question of, like, why do you need these trials, and
why did they bother?
Why did they bother about them? Yeah. Again, it also speaks to the question of how can we gauge, or how can we interpret, or how can we even, in the first place, find out what locals were thinking, or Soviet citizens were thinking about these trials. But again, if we go back to the Soviet secret police reports, then one man was quoted as saying as sort of that he about the trial in Nikolaev in 1946, that he not only wants to see Germans on trial, he also wants to see, in this case he says, Russians on trial, so Soviet citizens on trial. So if we look at, for instance, the complaint letters, or the letters that people send to the Soviet authorities, there are many letters where people sort of send in complaints and saying, why is it that this person has gone unpunished? Why is it that, how is it possible that this person who served in the police, or this person did, you know, help the Germans in whatever way, how is that possible that this person has yet not been prosecuted? So I do think if we combine that with these kinds of letters that people send to the authorities, we can see that there is a need, sort of, at least among some parts of people, some people want to see justice being done, and want to sort of, is it either their property being returned, want to see people who have committed murder being put on trial. So I think the Soviet authorities both respond to it and kind of preempt it in a way. which is also why I think these trials are, for instance, the Chernigov trial. Which one was that again? This one here. If you look at the speech by the prosecutor and then the speech by the defense attorneys, it's interesting to see that they, while they mention the international context, and they also sort of mention sort of changed political situations, they very much make this also again about a local trial. So this is about bringing Germans, or in this case Hungarians, sort of on trial for what they did in that particular district. And so there are the local witnesses on trial, there's the quoting, the stressing sort of the murder of civilians. So I think that responds to a perception of, we need to show that we are taking care of this and we are bringing people to justice. And then the Holocaust, yeah. I would think that what I've seen so far is that it corresponds to Karel Berkov's sort of interpretation, or Karel Berkov's analysis of how the Holocaust was reported on during the war, where he essentially says it's not that it was negated or it was completely absent from the Soviet press. It was present, it just wasn't, how should you put it? It was very carefully made public. It was there, but it wasn't sort of as something that was overly publicized. And Jewish victims would sometimes be Jewish victims, and sometimes they would be peaceful Soviet citizens. And that sort of the image of the Soviet Union as entirely ignoring or entirely downplaying the Holocaust is not correct. It's just that the way that it's being put in the newspapers or it's being publicized was very careful and limited to a certain extent. And I see this in the post-war trials too. Like for instance, in the Lviv trial, their witnesses mention how certain German soldiers were participated in the shooting of Jews in Lviv. And so even in the trials it is mentioned, and I've also seen it in the newspapers once or twice. Again, not too much of it, if you want, but once in a while it does surface. So it seems to me that, in my understanding, it sort of corresponds to kind of what Karel Berkov has analyzed for the war. And then the change in the 1960s and 1970s, yeah, I'm probably not going to go there because it's like, I feel like this project itself still requires so much research that this might be going too far. But that's a very sort of interesting question. Why is it that it changes? Why is it that it also changes not after the Eichmann trial, but shortly before the Eichmann trial? I think even the first article about a Soviet citizen on trial appears even before Eichmann was arrested. So it cannot be an entirely response to sort of the Eichmann trial, but for whatever reason I think it was something that was preceding it. And I think my understanding so far is that I see it linked more to a broader shift. So Polly Jones has written a book about how 1916 is a turning point in the way that the Stalinist past in the 1930s is sort of being narrated in the Soviet Union, being dealt with. And I think the 1930s are very much linked to the war then. And so 1960 is also a crucial point when the war narrative sort of changes. And I would say that the trials are sort of a part of that change of dealing with the Soviet past. But yeah, but I'm probably going to leave it at the immediate afterward for this project. Yeah.
Maybe
as you try to reconstruct these trials, which obviously took place while many people, common people, were participating, do you also try to make use of eyewitnesses, oral history in any way? Or are we dealing here with a generation which is, of course, hard to actually grasp in terms of eyewitness reports? But could this be an interesting way of also adding information to the picture you have?
Yeah, no, that would certainly be really interesting. I've done some oral history interviews for them for the dissertation. Back then, my oral history interviews were developing as I was sort of developing the archival research, so to say, or as that would take in place. So back then, that wasn't one of the questions that I asked my respondents. it also, part of the problem was that, at least for me, sort of as somebody who is not from the region and as somebody who speaks Russian with an accent, it was very difficult to get access actually to oral history interview partners. I mean, this, for instance, you could probably try to do this in Marina Gorka and see whether there are still people who alive who remember the trials and do this systematically. That would be fascinating, yeah. As sort of in terms of my own resources, that wasn't necessarily possible for me. Like the way that I met essentially my interview partners is that I first thought, okay, I need a plan. I need a structured plan how to approach people and then to come up sort of with a database, if you will. But then I just didn't really know how to do it. So every time I would meet somebody during that year while I lived in Minsk, I essentially just told them, well, I'm interested in doing interviews and this is my project. And then, you know, friends or acquaintances would say, oh, well, my grandmother, I can ask my grandmother, would you like me to ask her? And I said, sure, you know, because I thought until I have sort of a thought out research plan of how I'm going to do this, this is the way that, the only way I can do about it. And then later on it turned out that this was actually my strategy, if you will. Like, I think this was the only way that I could gain access, which is obviously because it's also such a difficult thing. I mean, this is such a highly personal moment when you talk to people that you don't know, often in their house, and then you leave again, and all of a sudden you're no longer there in that life. So, to make a long story short, yes, that would be, I think, a fantastic source, but I don't really see it working out. I would have to now go back and try to do it systematically, and more like an anthropologist, and I don't know if I have the resources for that. So.
It's, as you said, it's a difficult topic to talk, and but it's a very special moment. You've mentioned this global moment, but it's also a moment when trials are instrumentalized. And here I do refer to part of your dissertation. There was a very interesting way how you approached post-war trials in Belarus, about this paradoxical and then yet connected strategies of tearing apart society and gluing it together after the war. So this is like this liminal part where it's whether this is a question, whether this is a continuation of war or beginning of new life, or life before, or life after the war, or the getting away from war, and at the same time experimenting. So on this, you know, how you see this instrumental part on different levels, from participants you described from the state perspective, from the perspective of institution, and also of people living, especially on the local level. And maybe if you can, how seeing these trials also globally in different parts. Oh, we have such wonderful music. So, who is responsible for that? Be brave. Come up. Coming up. Yes. Yes. So it's nobody wants to. Yes. Oh, no, thank you. So actually, if to go to take this global comparison, not only in the experimenting legally by different states and in different situations, it's also from the social perspective of unmaking and remaking societies after the conflict, violence, and war. How you would lend this flashlight on your research? That's.
So that's a. I mean, sort of speaking about. This is obviously based on sort of secondary literature that I've read about the trials in non-Soviet Europe, so mostly Western Europe and East Asia. I mean, what seems to be striking about it is whether you lived in an authoritarian state or in a sort of democratic state, or a state that was reorganizing itself democratically, is that these trials responded to or were sort of enacting a certain kind of need for retribution that you can see everywhere. And so that is, and and then like regardless of the sort of some legal questions involved, and then regardless of sort of the big overall question, do you have due process of law or not? I mean, even in obviously even these trials in Western Europe in the immediate aftermath are sometimes very politicized. There's many emotion. There's much sort of many of them are sort of quickly administrative justice. It's also many of them wouldn't necessarily hold up to the standards of justice that we have nowadays. So I think that's probably also important to when we characterize this global moment as one is where justice is happening in a time of great flux, and not just in a time where there's still millions of people on the move, but it's also in a time where, as you said, like these societies are not even really beginning to reconfiguring itself, but it's really mostly, I would understand that it's a you're just sort of living in a sort of lots of, or with lots of death and destruction. Obviously there's significant differences throughout Europe, but this question of how can justice be administered in that context is always one that's sort of very precarious, and one where strong sort of political motivations played a role, whether you were sort of, as said, like in an illiberal system or in a liberal system. So I think that would be probably a common denominator almost, that again, as said, like many of these trials wouldn't necessarily uphold our standards of justice today. So that, which you can even say like it plays into, there's a much bigger history, which is the history of treason, and the history of, you know, why is treason as a concept so important in the post-war years, and what does it tell us about conceptions of a nation state, or in the case of the Soviet Union, and just sort of conceptions of citizenship or subjecthood, and what sort of is expected of people. Why is it, for instance, I mean, what's interesting about the trials in the Soviet Union is, of course, that there's no difference being made between the old and the new Soviet territories. So somebody in Lithuania would also be put on trial for treason, although you could obviously make an argument that, you know, why should that person feel any loyalty to the Soviet state? Now, you can also make that case for anybody, you know, essentially, like, why should anybody feel loyalty to a particular state? But this is not how these trials are organized, you know. So it does tell you very much about a strong sort of nation state and obligations of people and responsibilities and nationalism that comes into that moment, which is, I think, certainly present not just in the Soviet Union, but everywhere globally, so to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming to Lviv to share your research, your findings, and we wish you all the best, and also some returns to Lviv. And great that not only globally your research expands, but it also expands regionally, including Ukraine and including going far beyond Belarus.
And I want to thank all the participants for having come here on Friday, right before the Easter holidays. I want to wish all of you a happy Easter. Once again, thank you very much indeed for your attention. All the best to all of you. Thank you.